we also, secondly, among the women who are in agriculture sector, we find that most of them are in rural areas. So despite India's increasing urbanization, over 80% of rural women are again in agriculture, and only 20% of them are in other sectors. Secondly, in spite of this huge number of women being in agriculture, they're quite invisible because of their land ownership status. So we see that about 86%, about 14% of, only 14% of agricultural land is owned by women. And this 14%, most of it, almost 70% of it is small and marginal farmers, which is less than 2 hectares. So in India, we are having this sort of this double dichotomy of both increased climate risk and a feminization of agriculture that's happening simultaneously. So in 2023, there was this research that came out where they were looking at agri-food systems and the highest climate risk. And India is among the top 15 countries across the world where women in agri-food systems face the highest climate risk. This means they have increased vulnerability due to limited access to resources, lack of agency to absorb the shocks and adapt to climate impacts. And simultaneously, we're seeing this outmigration of male farmers and youth to urban areas because, simply putting it, agriculture does not pay. So this is resulting in women's increased labor alongside their other responsibilities as well, which is called as a triple burden. So together, what is happening is we're not only facing a decrease in production, but mostly a loss of income, which is negatively impacting livelihoods for millions of smallholders across the country. So what are some frameworks that are broadly about gender equality? One of the things I want to first sort of take a step back to help you understand is that, understanding that gender equality is not just a matter of social justice, but it's really good for the society and good for economy. And this is how public policy views gender equality. And the role of public policy in addressing equality is in two ways. One, you address the systemic barriers, discriminatory practices, and social norms. And secondly, you ensure equal resources and opportunities for women and girls in various spheres. And these spheres include things like social infrastructure, education, health, infrastructure in urban and rural areas. We're talking about the political sphere, where policies, processes such as gender budgeting, representation in politics. Thirdly, we're looking at economic empowerment, including women's workforce participation, labor welfare, social protection, financial linkages. And fourthly, legal reforms and protection, which includes laws, safety, quotas, etc. So sort of keeping this in mind, there are three major frameworks, policy frameworks that guide gender equality globally. The first one is CEDAW, which is a convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. This is actually a legally binding document that was signed in 1979, and most countries have signed the CEDAW, including India. And this specifically in Article 14 talks about rural women and really highlights the need for women's participation in planning, agrarian and land reform, and policies that target women farmers. The second is SDGs. Most people are probably aware of SDGs. It is much more better known. And because it focuses on sustainable development across Agenda 2030, SDG 2 on zero hunger, 5 on gender equality, 10 on reducing inequalities, and 13 on climate, all of these do address gender equality in various areas. Gender equality in agriculture. And thirdly, the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action in 1995, which recently celebrated its 30 years last year. And even in the Beijing Declaration, which is a very comprehensive declaration, it recognized the burden of poverty on women, especially linked to the lack of agricultural resources, and specifically called for the need to address structural barriers. So all of these are great frameworks. We know the context, but what does that look like in action? And I'll specifically speak towards climate resilience and some labor needs addressing the feminization of agriculture. So there are, we need firstly a granular understanding of women's roles, needs, and challenges in agriculture. Specifically, we need to look to see where are women farmers playing a role across production, post-harvest, and marketing. We know from research and from experience being on the field, anybody who's been in agriculture sector knows that women lack access to extension and advisory services. They don't have access to information or better inputs. And here, inputs, I mean not just seeds, but also fertilizers and pesticides. Thirdly, they do also lack access to timely and appropriate technology. In terms of post-harvest, that is once the production processes are done, again, we know this women face barriers in accessing technologies for post-harvest processing and the quality assurance mechanism that is directly tied to pricing. And thirdly, in the marketing side, women lack timely pricing information and access to higher value markets beyond the local markets. In addition to these, we have more, I would say, specific gender barriers. So even if proven technologies exist, women face these additional barriers. And this, of course, the first and foremost is land ownership. As we know, you are not considered a farmer unless you own land. And this affects access to credit, access to subsidies, access to technologies, because most schemes are still designed to be accessed by those with land ownership. Secondly, looking at time and labor burden. As we had mentioned earlier, women don't have much time because they're doing everything on the farm and off the farm. Thirdly, mobility challenges. We might see in most rural areas, depending on how close you are to a main road, that changes everything in terms of where you procure your seeds, where you get access to information, even access to trainings. All of this changes with mobility, and we know women specifically have this more of a challenge than men do. Fourthly, literacy barriers. Especially rural women are more likely to have had lesser education in comparison to men, which affects their ability to understand information, especially when it is presented through presentations, formal trainings. Fifthly, looking at household decision making. And I combine this with social norms, where even if all of these other things were taken care of, a major thing that's keeping women behind in agriculture in adopting new innovations is household decision making, where women cannot make decisions on what to plant, when to plant, how much to use of fertilizer, what technologies do we use, when do we sell, how much do we keep back for our own household consumption. And this is directly related also to the social norms, broadly speaking. And if we really want our policy and programs to address constraints, we can look at it in three ways, especially when it comes to innovations. So the first thing is the individual constraints, like some of these things I just discussed, like can women decide? Do women control and access technologies and resources? Those are more individual. But then there's also things that the innovations themselves lack right now. And one of the biggest things is, are they designed for women? Do they address, in the way they're disseminated, do they address women's barriers in learning? And thirdly, are they addressing women's constraints in accessing adoption and use? And at the much bigger picture too, looking at the systemic and structural constraints, where we're looking at the institutional biases that agricultural partners might have. And this includes, what we have: national, subnational, state, district, block level, looking at policies and governance, and again, social cultural norms. So for the next minute or so, I just wanted to provide some practical tips from what we have seen in our work, looking at IFPRI's framework, which I find extremely helpful. So this is a very simplified way of saying, how can I ensure policies and programs are aligned for women's needs? And we just look to see, are we intentionally including women? That's under reach. Do our programs or policies increase women farmers' access to inputs, finance, extension services, or how are we benefiting women? And thirdly, how are we empowering women? And that is specifically by strengthening their ability to make strategic life choices and put those choices into action. So under reach, some solutions could include extension services and ensuring that they are available to women. One thing that we have seen recently is digital extension services. Yes, there are barriers women face with accessing, with even smartphone use, but I have been surprised in my more recent field trips. Again, depending on how close women are to a main road, they have more access to smartphones with the availability of data as well. And digital extension services can address some of the traditional barriers women face with going to a KVK to attend a training. They are now available in local languages. We are using videos, and I would also include YouTube here. You'd be surprised with the number of people who are using YouTube to learn more information. and using images as well. In successful cases, what we have seen is you pair a digital solution with the physical agent who explains things in case there are digital barriers, especially in places where data might not work. Some good examples I've seen are WhatsApp chatbots and recently also Farmer Chat, which is more AI driven by Digital Green. Secondly, to again reach women with more information, I would say access to public sector extension of officers is very important. Here, we don't have, from my knowledge, and maybe you can also add more, Divya, we don't have women extension agents in the public side. But if we can hire women extension agents and provide, this will help us provide specialized training for women farmers on production, using, making sure the trainings are at a time that is convenient for women, the content is relevant to women and their roles, the language is also accessible for the women. Thirdly, we also need to involve women farmers as lead farmers or innovators. Very often when we test out new innovations, whether it is a better seed for drought-resistant seed, better fertilizer, a new cropping mechanism, like fertigation, where you're really applying fertilizer where irrigation is happening, we never use women as lead farmers. It's always a middle-income male farmer. So what if we can change that to include women as lead farmers and innovators? And finally, looking at women as micro-entrepreneurs. Under the benefit, so that is where we reach women, but now to really make sure that women are benefiting from technologies, especially for time and labor-saving technologies, the first thing is, how can we ensure women have access to appropriate technologies? Here, I'm mentioning the use of post-harvest technologies, but this could be anything. This could be even for transplanting, as we see in Tamil Nadu. It's usually women are the ones who do rice transplanting in Tamil Nadu. So, and we know there's access to mechanization that does do transplanting. So if it helps, and if it does not, I would say, replace women's labor, can we introduce such mechanization? And even if women are not directly operating it, what if these can be run as enterprises, custom hiring centers, Trump custom hiring centers? One of the examples we are seeing is S4S Technologies that specifically has drying and post-harvest processing through solar dryers, and they are engaging women as micro-entrepreneurs in this process. Another thing that we have seen under some women-led FPOs under Jivika, I think it was through a project done by, funded by the Walmart Foundation, if I'm right, where they were looking at quality assurance equipment and certification. So where women were specifically provided with, equipment like moisture sensors, weighing machines, gradation machines, because a higher quality of crop that you have, the more you have better pricing. And we saw specifically women micro-entrepreneurs serving as these agents. So they were also making a commission on that. And finally, under Empower, it is very important that our policy initiatives have last mile accessibility, and specifically for government schemes. One of the best examples I have seen with this is Hab Darshak. It is a social enterprise, but they are providing access to government schemes to, again, women micro-entrepreneurs. So they are literally going with tablets, helping people apply for schemes that they're eligible for. And moving forward, we should also ensure that new schemes change eligibility to remove land ownership. From my understanding in recent union budgets, etc., this is happening and our government's policy notes. But we should also include, in addition to changing the scheme eligibility, to ensure that we can target women where they need support, whether it is production, post-harvest, marketing. Looking at access to finance. So access to finance in many ways has been done, but some things that we are also seeing is now increased debt amongst farmers. So this is something that we need to also look at through policy, maybe through basic financial literacy information and easier mechanisms for repayment. And finally, something innovative is also to minimize the risk by accessing parametric insurance, especially for landless laborers. This was recently done in Ahmedabad and Gujarat, looking for women who were laborers. When certain extreme temperatures were met, then automatically insurance payouts go to the women directly into their bank accounts. Tamil Nadu is also piloting this in Kadalur, I believe. looking at cyclone and flood preparedness. This is, of course, not directly related to farmers, but this could be something that we're thinking of. So to conclude, I just have some thoughts because in some ways I feel like it's a lot of information over here. But some areas for improvement in policy for gender equality in agriculture, 4 questions. One is we have a lot of schemes already, but we don't have enough information to see are these schemes, impacting women. Like even if you think of the Reach, Benefit, Empower framework I just mentioned, are they reaching women? We know that we have amount set apart, but are they reaching women beneficiaries? Are women benefiting from these schemes, and are they truly being empowered by these schemes as well? And this would require more of probably evaluations, data collection, especially sex disaggregated data collection at the government level. Secondly, how can we better connect women farmers to benefit more from research and extension advisory systems? I know MSSRF does a lot of research. The CG institutions do research. ICAR does research as well. But how are we ensuring that women farmers are able to benefit more? I'm sure women are benefiting already, but how can we ensure that the research translates more to on-ground impact in greater scale? Thirdly, how can we scale proven innovations for labor saving and improve climate resilience for women farmers in partnership with the private sector? If I'd mentioned about the lack of scale earlier, I think the private sector can enable scale, but this requires more of the public-private partnerships, which are hard to implement, though they sound great in theory. But this is something for us to think about as well, the role of the private sector. And finally, women FPOs, there's a lot of research that shows that they can address a lot of the challenges that I had mentioned about. But also from our experience, women FPOs are not well functioning. If there are 10 women FPOs, there's probably one that is well functioning at every single level. So we do need to think about how to strengthen existing women's FPOs for greater impact and reach. On that, I will end. Thank you so much. And I will stop screen sharing as well.
Thanks, Maria. Divya, do you want to go next? You see my screen? Yes, we can.
Hi. So my presentation is going to be there's 3 sections. One, I'm going to talk a little bit about what DDS is, Deccan Development Society, and what we do, and why I suppose I've been called to make this presentation. Two, I will talk about some of the core pillars of DDS's work and how DDS has achieved some of the things it has. And three, my own reflections on the status of women farmers today and the future. And positionality is always important. So, in light of that, I'll also say I've been with DDS for the last 2 years, serving as a director. But DDS is an organization that's quite old, has been around for 42 years actually. And so I come at this also as a researcher, but as a learner as well of the things that generations of women before have actually done. With that, I'll talk about DDS. So, Deccan Development Society is based in Telangana. We work primarily with women farmers and actually only with women farmers in the form of sangams. So, in every village that DDS works, the women are organized into groups called sangams, and sangams are the unit of functioning for DDS. Primarily, the core work that DDS does is actually around food sovereignty. It's one of the connecting threads across decades of DDS's work. And the way DDS has gone about this is initially, when DDS started working here, you must remember Telangana was a very drought-prone region. Not a lot of crop diversity, but not a lot of security in how crops were grown. And the second part is DDS works as a matter of, as one of its core principles with the most marginalized community or women in any given village. And very often that means Dalit women. So nearly all of the women that we work with are either from Dalit or SD communities in the region. And so this is also at a time when land was not something that was accessible to Dalit households, as I'm talking back in the 80s. But Telangana is also one of the states that's been lucky, actually, because land redistribution programs, 3 waves of land redistribution, have also meant that a lot of households, formerly landless households, do have access to land. And the land redistribution also happened in such a way that the state, by policy, included women of the household in all of the land pattas, actually. And so women had access to land on paper. But this is something you might have already come across in your own field areas. But there are plenty of cases where when land is distributed to a household, they have a piece of land that's the piece of paper saying they have land, but they actually don't know where the land is physically and are not in possession of the land as well. And so back in the 80s, DDS took up work in about 100 villages, identifying which lands were the ones that were redistributed. And often these are common lands, so they're not cultivated lands. They're typically barren and common lands. And so the lands were brought into cultivation. This involved doing watershed work, soil restoration, land restoration, and working on giving access to all of the resources that the community needed for cultivating this land. And so what do I mean by giving access to all of the resources that the community needed? So if you need to cultivate land, you need to have seeds. And so DDS worked on putting together a community seed system, actually. So a seed bank where women individually store seeds, but also collectively there is a community level seed bank where if in one village you have run out of seed, or if due to drought or floods, your village has run out of a particular type of seed, you are able to come to the seed bank, the central seed bank, which acts, which is a fallback mechanism and is also something that does conservation work. So if your village is not necessarily conserving all 80 varieties of indigenous seeds of the region, some 10-20 varieties that farmers are not cultivating are conserved in the community seed bank. So it is both a risk management mechanism and a conservation strategy. So community seed bank being one. The second one so you need seed, you also need access to capital. And so DDS started doing micro credit, particularly for cultivation, actually. And so DDS Sangams also function as thrift and credit groups. But on top of that, particularly for cultivation, there are advances given to ensure that women have credit for doing the type of farming that they need to do. Something else that DDS works on is also these Sangams also work as collective groups for doing for labor sharing, actually. And this is not an uncommon practice. Women's groups across the country, actually, say a group of 10 women will weed together in one farm, and then the next farm, and then the next farm together, so that they're saving on labor cost. And this is a practice that is systematically incorporated into the DDS Sangams, labor sharing as well. And then after that, once we have produce, what do we do with that? Then the women together also run a cooperative. So the DDS Women's Cooperative has about 2,500 members and actively does both bulk marketing and retail sales, both primary and secondary processing. And one of the advantages, of course, that the cooperative has is that we're quite close to Hyderabad, and so we're able to do direct retail sales, which is something that many FPOs are not able to do, but we are able to do it and take advantage of being close to the city. And so Sangam Organics is a brand of its own, certified organic now. Apart from that, the district KVK is also run by DDS, so it is a DDS KVK, and is a fully organic KVK as well. But one of the things that I think sets DDS apart when thinking about inclusive rural development to me is that the organization has always taken a very holistic approach to development. And so this is one of the first pillars of DDS's work that I'll talk about, which is the problems that DDS sets out to address. There's no agenda of this is a problem that we want to solve, but rather you are Sangams, and as women's groups, what is the problem that you need to face? And so the problem might be we can't access our land, we can't grow food, there's not enough food in the households, there's no food security. But the problem can also be our kids need a better place for education, our kids need a place to stay, so we need like a creche center. And so over time, many of the programs that DDS have taken up have reflects the needs of the community. And so the first principle is always that, very often we talk about community generated, community partnered, community managed, and often there's a lot of lip service to these terms. But fundamentally, if the community is not the one that's defining the problem, we take up a lot of projects where we don't think about who does this project benefit, right? And whose purpose does it solve? So who's defined the problem? And who benefits from the execution of this problem. And very often it can be the organizations or the researchers themselves, and perhaps not necessarily the community. And so involving the community from that stage of defining the problem is one of the core aspects of what DDS does. And so this meant that, beyond working on food systems, DDS has also worked on education. Historically, DDS ran balwadis that were essentially creche systems before Anganwadis were formally introduced by the government. And so women would leave their kids in balwadis and would collectively farm to ensure nutrition security for the children of the village, or at least of the Sangam. This also travels into thinking about women's health, actually, especially when thinking back to a time where and today as well, actually, women don't comfortably talk about their health in public spaces. Many women's health issues go unaddressed. And if women actually need resources for accessing medical care, particularly for reproductive health, they either don't have the money for it or don't have a way or a place where they can go and borrow such money, actually. And so the women's sangams, one of the first conversations that happens in the sangams is also about health, and very actively talking about general and reproductive health. And so the sangams also advance support both in terms of time and resources from members, but also in terms of if you need short-term financial support so that you're not going into debt for getting medical care. But the second aspect is also plant-based medicine. Now, also, again, I talk about the historical aspect, because think about a time when women didn't necessarily have access to public health systems, and also had quite a treasure trove of knowledge on plant-based medicine. And we all understand the value of this today, but DDS has systematically done work on, one, documenting all of the traditional practices in the area when it comes to plant-based medicine, two, training a new generation of women in using these, and three, of course, having knowledge is not enough if you don't have access to the resources. And so in front of every household for basic medicinal plants, DDS has taken up cultivation activities, and in many villages actually cultivated medicinal groves. So a few acres of land that are cultivated with medicinal trees, herbs, and plants. So again, thinking about a holistic approach, it doesn't matter what it is that you take up. If you're not addressing all of the problems along the supply chain, then that problem isn't addressed. If you're only thinking about knowledge without thinking about the implementation part, then we can't move ahead. And if we're only thinking about external knowledge systems without acknowledging and addressing, without understanding what knowledge already exists in the community so that we can incorporate into our programs, again, very often we set ourselves up for failure. Apart from this work, DDS also is known for doing media work. So we run a community radio station, which to my understanding is one of India's first community radio stations, which is run by the women farmers here. You can see in the pictures, they do both audio and video content. And the idea behind the community radio station is simply that when outsiders come and tell our story, they tell that story from their lens. And so when we think of poverty, there's a perspective of, I think, when we come from a place of privilege, we tell stories of poverty, perhaps. But when the women tell their stories, they tell stories of dignity, of resilience, and that lens changes. And that's very important to the women here. And so the radio station has collectively, I think, about stories of about 2,000 songs and stories of the region. So it's actually a record of the cultural heritage of the region, and it's run very much in the local language. So thinking about women's extension as well, right? And again, the way DDS women think about extension is also quite different, actually. Very often we think about practices and teaching women how to do practices, right? You have to maybe do this and do that. But DDS's perspective is actually one of cultural shift. One of the things, again, as researchers, you might have, as you know, thinking about organic farming, natural farming, one of the things that comes up is actually the lack of peer support. They say, okay, my fellow farmer is getting 12 quintals out of his acre, and if I only get 10, there's a sense of competition. There's also a sense of people saying, like if everybody else is going one way and you're the only one going the other way, thinking about alternative practices, there's always a early adopter problem. And for DDS, shift is not at an individual level. It is always at a community level. It is always at the Sangam level. So together they think about what are the problems of the collective, what are the problems of our soils, of our lands, of our crops. And so collectively, what are the solutions we can bring together? And that creates a cultural shift. And then they talk about practices, because if the farmer is convinced that there needs to be a shift and we need to manage our soils better, they know that they have to put in farmyard manure. They know how they have to incorporate biomass. There's plenty of traditional practices, and then we supplement. There's a KVK. Then we think about other extension support systems. They're the ones who are actually talking to their community through the radio station, through the sangams, through other places. And so it's a community that's taken ownership of the issue, because they are the ones that are defining the problem. And broadly, I think I've covered the work, but like I said, I will end with thinking about the pillars of work at DDS, right? So one is that for women, be it about food, be it about market, be it about media, be it, in all of these aspects, autonomy is actually integral to program design here. So as a community, can we independently make decisions? Can we control the prices for the food that we grow? Can we control what crops we grow, which means that we need to have access to the seeds, right? Can we control our own lands? Can we control our own narrative and stories? And so autonomy becomes the defining idea here. It's not necessarily about quantifiable things. Perhaps it's not necessarily always about, do I have higher income or lower income or more yield or less yield, but rather, do I have control over what my family is growing and eating and how I am living my life? The second core aspect of the work that DDS does is that much of this is rooted in community wisdom and knowledge. Now, let's be clear, I don't think it's necessarily to idolize or romanticize traditional knowledge. And I understand that, there's many different ways of understanding what is traditional, what is not. And one person's tradition might be somebody else's oppression also. But fact of the matter is, when it comes to their own lands and resources and seeds, the women know best actually what works, and working with that knowledge is what makes the biggest difference. And so preserving communities' knowledge is a very important part of the work that we do. And finally, that it is not just about me as an individual, as a farmer, but also about the ecosystem, and to take a rather holistic approach, both as an organization and as sangams. And I said I would also sort of end on my own reflections on this. And one of the things I think last year I sat with the staff, and one of the questions that I had asked was, DDS has done all of this and is known for its work with women farmers. Do you think you've made a big difference? Are our women empowered? Because, there's so many pictures. They've received awards from the president. They've gotten the Nari Shakti Puraskar. They're the Millet Sisters of India. They're everywhere and well known for this work. They run a radio station and a media center, have made documentary films, traveled dozens of countries. Are they empowered? What does it mean? And one thing that the first response that came was actually, and this is sort of a collective response from staff who've been here for decades, is, in the beginning, when we told women they must leave their homes, we had to drag them out. They were very often, it was very difficult to get them out of their house. But now that they're out of their house and doing all these things, we wonder if we have done the women a disservice. And what they mean by this is that the pressures on women have increased quite a lot. And just like Maria's already talked about, there's increasing feminization of agriculture. In Telangana, 80% of women in rural households are engaged in agriculture. It's less than 50% across in Telangana and also across the country. So women are having to take care of their farms. They're having to take care of their families. They're also the ones through various programs we have targeted for giving loans, right? So they're the ones who have access to microfinance. They're the ones who have SHG loans. In many villages, actually, it's difficult for men to get loans. Women are the ones who are the only ones who can actually get loans these days, which means that a lot of their time has gone into loan servicing. And in our villages, we've noticed that if they can do not just one day of wages, one wage labor, they're actually taking multiple jobs in a day. Every single day has become valuable in a cash-based economy, where they also need money for, not just food, but also for healthcare, for education, for recharging their kids' mobile phones or getting petrol into their vehicles. It's a very consumer driven, because increasingly a consumerist society. And a lot of the pressure of fueling consumerism has actually fallen onto the women's heads. And again, I've talked about positionality before. I'm talking about deeply from our own experiences in Telangana and the work we do here and the experiences of the women here. And from my own research and national statistics, we know that women spend more time working. On average, they work about an hour more than men do. In a crop season, certainly, and outside of the crop season, thinking about, NREGA work as well, 60% of wage days are actually taken up by women, which means that women are being left behind in the villages. They're also the ones that are taking up, day wages and are taking up extra work, increasingly participating in the workforce. But then a lot of their incomes are going towards serving everyday needs of the household, while they're also bringing forward agriculture, which is increasingly risk-proof. And so the point that the staff were making was, we're not sure if we've done them a service at all, actually, because their lives are harder these days. And I asked the same question to the women, actually, the karyakartas and the women farmers. And one of the things that truly was a striking answer for me was, DDS has done all these things. So we have a market, we do this, we have livestock, we have our farming, we have our seeds. But we don't know what the future, so we are fine, but we don't know what the future of our children will be. And one of the disturbing trends that we've seen is DDS also works on legal issues. So we have legal karyakartas trained in both leadership and working with police in case of issues of domestic violence. We used to run a women's shelter as well and work with the Sakhi centers here, so on and so forth. One of the issues that DDS worked on early on quite a bit was violence within the household. So it was husbands beating wives. But increasingly, this violence has shifted to sons in the household, actually. So sons, being violent in the household, substance abuse becoming increasingly a problem. Again, the pressure of that, financing that falling to the women. But, recharge my phone or I'll break the TV, or, incidents of this sort that we've noticed quite a lot. And when the nature of violence have shifted, when you talk about, doing something when your husband is violent, women are more active. But when the sons are the ones who are violent, there's not much anybody can do, and the women themselves are not very vocal about it. And I think when we think of program design, and I want to take this space because it's not often that we go out and say, think about women's time and leisure. But I think it's important to think about that, when we say we have to do, they have to do their farming, they have to service loans, they have to have livestock, they have to run FPOs, they have to do marketing, they have to do 100 other things, value addition, this, that. and that all of these activities, livelihoods have to fit into the free time that women have. Is that really a realistic thing? And so what does empowerment mean beyond what is financial and tangible, perhaps? And so I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Divya. I mean, I loved the photographs, and I mean, it was just beautiful, especially the one where the kids were sitting in the library. So refreshing. And we didn't plan this before, but surprisingly, the first question I had is was also relating to the idea of a public ecosystem for care. Uh, I mean, like you said, we are increasingly, our agriculture is increasingly feminizing the responsibility of social reproduction and household food security, of agriculture. Everything is increasingly falling on women. And we often call this empowerment, but it is not. It is actually burdening women with a lot more responsibilities. So I wanted to ask the both of you, what is stopping us from really thinking about a public care ecosystem? What is it? Why is it that the policymakers are not thinking of investing in this? Uh, and like a recent article on the Wire was saying, why can't we finance the public care ecosystem like we finance for highways? So yeah, I'll ask this question to the both of you first.
Would you like to go first? Can't hear you.
You can go ahead, Divya.
Yeah. No, that's such a good question. And in a way, we've tried, right? Like with the Anganwadi ecosystem, that's at least one stab at it. And I think when we think of what the role of the government is, broadly, we think the role of the government is to provide education, healthcare, and infrastructure, at bare minimum, these three things. But it's not to say government should not be looking at having a public care ecosystem, but that our current attempts at it are actually quite abysmal also in many ways, right? Be it the Anganwadi infrastructure, the quality of meals that are provided, the quality of care, but primarily the biggest failure of thinking of a public care system is public schools, actually. Right. That is the first pathway. The kids are going to school, these institutions exist, but the fact that we've not resourced public schools enough and have sort of given up on it collectively as a country, including the women that we work with. None of them send their kids to public schools. They're all sent to private schools. And actually, it's not about, I mean, in my perspective, at least, it's not from 0 to 6, we have Anganwadis, and then after that, in school going age, we do have public schools. Strengthening these institutions would be the first step, I think. I mean, before we even imagine more parallel systems, yeah.
So to add to what Divya is saying, I think the biggest reason is because it's invisible. So the time that women spend on care, and I think Divya, you brought it out really well when you were talking about, women are doing everything. So there is not much of an understanding, I would say, by decision makers on how much time women are spending on just domestic work and care. And then they don't know the monetary cost of it. In fact, I recently came across a report in 2020 done by ILO and Oxfam, which said that the economic contribution of women's unpaid domestic work and care work globally every year is 10.8 trillion US dollars. And in case that number sounds too, big and crazy, as of 2025, our top 5 tech companies, including Google, Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, and Nvidia, only had a revenue of 2 point something trillion dollars. So again, where is 2? Where is 10.8? And this is happening across the world, not just India. And once now, and the way that research came about, like they literally did a replacement cost methodology. You see the amount of time women are spending globally, and then you put a minimum wage value on it. by country, and then you aggregate it, and this is how they came up with this number. So coming back to your question, why are we not doing anything about it? I would actually say I think there is more talk about it now. I have seen a lot more push, both in the policy side as well as by donors, as well as by international organizations in this space. It probably hasn't trickled down yet to the extent needed. But I do know that, for example, India is planning, I believe, to come up with a care policy. I know UNDP is doing a lot on care work in India. UN Women is also doing a lot of work on care in India. The Tamil Nadu government, with the TNVC project, which is a Women's Employment and Safety Project, they specifically have a major component specifically highlighting care and to see how to reduce care. And they're developing care models. They are trying to figure out, whether it should be in working spaces for, urban women, what about rural women? Also, as Divya mentioned, Anganwadi versus after-school care. So, right, I would say it is still in nascent stages, but that understanding is there. I think it'll still take a few years for it to be from, more of ideation to implementation, and for women to see the benefits of it. But I believe I believe the ball has been set rolling, but it is still, of course, the initial stages.
Yeah. I mean, of course, the audiences, you can start asking questions. I'm just taking advantage of my role as the moderator, but please ask. I mean, you could either raise your hand and ask the question or type it. And while we are waiting for them to ask, can I ask the both of you about natural farming, right? I mean, it's being pushed as a policy from the central government, state governments, but the understanding of the social relations that underpin natural farming is still ambiguous. We don't know the gender relations that underpin natural farming as yet. I mean, whatever evidence we have, it's ambiguous. We don't know if it's good or bad for women. So, what in your experience has been like, the outcomes of natural farming for women, and what would it take to make it more gender just?
I can take this one first as well, but that's such a good question, and it was actually one of the questions I asked during my PhD work as well. So paper TBD, by the way. But one thing I think the biggest concern that comes up is a lot of the practices that are taught as part of natural farming are typically considered to be women's labor, and so have a disproportionately higher impact on women's time, actually. And to be honest, so there's two ways to think about it. Actually, as part of my previous research, we did we collected data from about 1,500 households, including men and women of the same household. And compared the amount of time that men and women in natural farming households or organic farming households were doing versus those in a transitioning group, mixed practices, and then those in conventional households. And one of the, about 1,500 households, so about 2,500 individuals actually we spoke to, and did 24-hour time diaries, looking at how many hours in each day they were spending on farming versus care work versus other things. And one thing that was quite clear was that both men and women were putting more time in natural farming households. So the difference was clear across both genders. What was different, though, was that for women, it looked like they were not able to compensate this difference fully by reducing their time doing other things. So household work, for example. So if men were doing more organic farming, they were doing less, perhaps a bit less work in, like salaried jobs or other businesses that they were running, compensating for that time. But women didn't really show that sort of a compensation in their time. And that was one of the difference that I felt is, again, thinking about, not just that it is natural farming that's the problem, but patriarchy, as usual in general, is the problem, which is that yes, both of them are spending more time, but who's able to compensate and take some of their time away from other things in that equation. The other thing actually is one of the things that other researchers have also talked about and others have talked about is who your point of entry is in a village. And Maria actually brought up this point, which is that do we have women extinction agents? To my knowledge, there's two major programs that have women extinction agents. One is the MKSP program, that works with women, and then the Krishi Sakhi programs that Maharashtra and others have taken up. But or Himachal, for example, in the natural farming program, women self-help groups are the point of entry. And so the observation was that when the women are the ones that are taught the practices, they also have the burden of implementing the practices. And so, what happens is when we think of high technology extinction, it typically goes to the men. When we think of organic and natural and sustainable practices, it typically goes to the women. And that's where the disproportionate burden on their time is actually coming from. And whether program targeting is really what's causing this is something that we need to study and understand further. But yeah, my 2 cents on it is yes, it is a problem. We do have to think about ways of reducing women's drudgery in agriculture in general and also in natural farming. But three, the larger question of ensuring women have leisure time remains both within natural farming and outside of it. Yeah.
So to add to what Divya is saying, absolutely right. In terms, we have seen that the same thing in multiple countries where natural farming ends up being much more time and labor intensive, especially for women. So we had specifically done a project in Cambodia looking at conservation agriculture. And what we found is that with practices of, for example, conservation agriculture, one of the practices is no-till farming or reduced tillage farming. But with no-till or reduced tillage, the biggest issue was weeds. And with weeds, who's responsible for weeding? It's women. So it comes back to like what even Divya was talking about, the labor and the time burden comes back to women. So same thing now, again, even you're talking about manure, for instance, or even something like vermicompost. Who's responsible for all of that? It's women. Who's the one who is going and putting taking care of the vermicompost, coming back to the farm to apply the vermicompost, make sure the system is actually working? It's all women. Same thing with cow manure as well. So some of these, it has, I think, on many countries, not just India, what we're finding is while these sort of regenerative agricultural practices are important moving forward, right now, they end up causing more of a burden on women. But I also wanted to talk a little bit, in this case, in terms of here's where income matters. Now, what we are finding in certain places, and again, Divya, you put it so well, but some of the high-tech stuff is targeted at men. So I have seen specific private sector organizations, for instance, that are more looking at the carbon markets, where they are saying if you follow practice 1, 2, and 3, let's say, for example, reduce tillage, maybe application of biofertilizers or a reduction in the use of chemical fertilizers, not using pesticides, but some sort of natural pesticides that are being used. So when they meet these specific metrics, they are registered and for specific seasons, like maybe for 2 seasons or 4 seasons for agricultural seasons, they're able to register their farms on the Vera registry. Now, of course, this requires a lot of hand-holding. This requires a lot of technical assistance and support, literally on a day-to-day basis by the agencies that are supporting the farmers to do it. And they have successfully registered farmers who have met these criteria on the Vera registry for eventual carbon credits. Now, I think that's a great win. But if you look to see who is actually registered, it is a middle income or high income male farmers. So coming back to this, it's how do we make sure it's gender just? I think it's going to take an ecosystem. It's not just say, look at cow manure. I think we have to go beyond that. It has to be beyond just natural farming. I think we really need to look at regenerative, maybe look at specific practices and not say go completely organic. Look at the market side of things where right now India does not have a proper organic certification. So even I have heard from farmers say that even if they grow something that is organic, how can you prove it in the market? and you do not get an increased, income for that. So again, if it is, you can do all the backbreaking work. If there's a certified source of additional income or higher value that you will get, which is where that quality assurance mechanism comes into place. So I think the only place where I have seen this work, not for women, but for men, is a public-private partnership, or again, private sector-led work. Now, maybe we should look to see how we can ensure it will benefit women as well, at scale, where again, it's not extra time, or even if it's extra time and labor, they're compensated for it and compensated monetarily for it. And if that we're able to do, I think it will, in India especially, it will require support from at every level, the private sector, the public sector, research institutions, CSO, civil society organizations, everybody really coming together to see at different components to make sure it actually does benefit farmers, both women and men.
Yeah. Thank you, Maria and Divya, for very insightful talk. I mean, linking framework to action. That's really we could able to link in both of your discussions. Definitely, this is a kind of an initiative which is taking place at the grassroots level and also reflecting at the policies. But how the granular understanding, as pointed out by Maria, that the gender roles, how it is related to the different interventions, which is empowering them, making them into a kind of a transformative path. That was visible in Divya's experience. I mean, the DDS experience over 4 decades almost. So, my question is, when we are working with women for such a long time, building the transformative path, how it is getting translated, those values at the household level, especially among youth, and how they see this transformative change and practice that change in their own life, and that is again reflected in the social sphere as well.
That's a good question, Lakshmi Aru. It's at least in our experience, I'll talk about at least about the DTS experience. One thing is that I think one, it's certainly increasingly easier for women to step out of the household, and if in fact they're expected to step out of the household and participate in the workforce increasingly. It's not the norm across the country, but certainly in some states, particularly in the southern region, this is true. But whether that's really changed the equation of decision making and power sharing in the households is truly unclear to me. What does make a difference, as Maria has already pointed out, is women having access to assets and resources in their name. The land is in her name, the business is in her name, the program is giving a subsidy in her name, the cow has come in her name, the loans have come in her name. It does make a difference, actually, the actual ability to control resources. And this makes so I don't know if someone once told me when I was 16, someone who works in civil society in West Bengal, women who have an education, we've simply traded our chains of rope with chains of gold. So we have education, but are we more empowered as individuals in our own households, right? And I think a lot of the women in our own generation, in our own community, when thinking about can we make decisions about our lives, our careers, our reproductive health, our partners, etc., etc., etc. How much autonomy do we have? And I think as a society, I don't know if we've really moved that far. And simply that, like, that's the answer. Like, I don't think there's been a huge fundamental shift in that women are still the ones who bear the brunt of violence, regardless of the source that it comes from. They're also the last ones to have a say in decision making. And any shift we see is incremental and marginal, and that it is marginally better. But I don't know if we're in a place to celebrate that. Yeah. Yeah.
Bahini, do you want to ask your question? It was on AI in agriculture.
Yeah, basically, just wanted to check with there are more emphasis on AI and AI being promoted in Maharashtra and other states as well. But then looking at the technology access to women, especially in rural India, and the amount of the phones availability with them. So how are we looking at introducing AI in agriculture for especially for women, and also in terms of reducing the drudgery? And also what kind of technologies or innovations are necessary, because we have institutions who are having technology, kind of museums that we have, but then are they really helpful for the women in the ground, or what is it required? So that's my question.
So from what I have seen, and this is probably limited perspective, I think the value immediately is in advisory services. And I have seen this I think the current example is like with Farmer Chat run by Digital Green, where it provides you information in the local language. Of course, they don't have all languages yet. That's part of training and, LLM. But with a few languages starting off, they do have advisory services, including, what crops can you grow in this area, soil health information, linking it with some of the more satellite data, etc. It also provides more or weather advisory services, including when to plant, when to harvest, and maybe like early warning systems for floods or heat. And I believe it also provides market pricing or linkage information. But the biggest thing, again, from my limited knowledge, is really just extension and advisory services. I don't know if it can reduce drudgery as much as it can at least provide information at this stage. But I mean, there might be more as well.
Actually,
Thanks,
also
Maria.
want to add a note of concern when thinking about AI, even for extension services, because in my own experience of thinking, I perhaps looking at some startups looking at trying to do AI-based extension services, these models are only as good as the knowledge we already have, right? So if it's garbage in, it's garbage out. And a lot of the fundamental problem is that many of these players in the market don't actually have the foundational knowledge on what should be grown and how it should be grown and how challenges should be addressed. And when there's no accountability, right? Like if you've given an advisory through an AI model and that advice doesn't work, then what is the recourse you have? And this is the same problem that exists in extension services in general. I mean, the number of cases I've seen of, the agriculture officer told me to spray this for my pest, and turns out it was herbicide, so everything's died off, was actually a real case that we faced, just in the last season. When human people standing in front of you who have degrees in this subject and are experts in that field, in your space have no accountability, then what AI agents will do in this space is also just a point of concern for me, and something to think about. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Right. So I think I have the right to the last question. I wanted to ask you that a lot of our interventions and more specifically in terms of building climate resilience, and we call it climate smart agriculture, these solutions are increasingly turning out to be technocratic without taking into account the social realities of patriarchy. And therefore, I mean, how much do you think we need climate smart agriculture practices or gender just and climate just sort of interventions? So, I mean, are we replacing justice to with technocracy is my question. And will this solve our issues if we go this way? And AI and all of these are examples of going in this direction, right?
If I could start, I don't think it's a either or. I think it's an and. I think we need both. We are going into a world where Our soil health has gone down. We are having extreme heat events. We're having drought, water issues, extreme flooding, and farmers are the ones who face the brunt of it. The rest of us, with those with some level of privilege, can escape to an AC room. Those without the privilege have to bear the heat, bear the floods, bear everything else. And the worst impacts are felt by farmers and even more so women farmers. So I don't think it's an either or. I think both are required. Now, how to do it is probably where I think it needs to be much more well thought out. For example, I have seen the gap in policies. So Tamil Nadu and India as a whole comes out with a national adaptation plan, and Tamil Nadu comes out with the state action plan for climate change as well, the SAPCC. What I found very interesting when I looked through it to see, how much had they accounted for women's needs, especially in agriculture, it was minimal, if not nothing. It focused only on dairy and it focused on one or two other things, but not much on agriculture and access to climate smart technologies or inputs or whatever it is, practices. So perhaps, yes, one part of it is including this, where that I don't think, for example, policymakers even understand where the gaps are right now for gender equitable climate smart innovations. That's one. So when we do help them understand that, number two, it does need to go into policy documents. Now, people may or may not read policy documents, but it at least is a document that holds governments to account. And I think that's why it's important. But three, to actually put it in practice, again, I think we need more of multi-stakeholder related work. And I know that sounds like a lot of jargon, but I do think every stakeholder has a role to play. I believe research institutions have a role to play. I believe the private sector has a role to play. Civil society organizations have a role to play, and especially the government. And the community-led organizations also have a big role to play. But the question is, how do we bring them all together with a shared understanding of what gender equitable climate smart innovations look like, or climate smart practices that are gender equitable look like? And how do we actually make it happen? Because it's great to have presentations, great to have reports, even great to have policies, which we don't have right now. But to put it into practice is the hardest thing. But that is important for sure.
Yeah, broadly agree with what Maria has already said. I don't think it's necessarily an either or, but be it technology or otherwise, the question to ask is the one of trade-offs, right? And in my presentation, I kind of talked about, whenever we take up a program, who's framed it as a problem and who benefits from implementing it. But the third question to ask is also who's losing out from implementing it. And if we're taking up programs that might look climate smart, but at the end of the day, women's livelihoods are the ones that are hit, then there goes your gender justice, right? So I think technology is absolutely necessary. I think. I don't think, technocentric and technocratic approaches are definitely a problem, but again, it's not an either or. And I think just like, climate change is a problem of this generation and the coming generation, which means that the solutions we have in the past are not necessarily the solutions that will be suitable for the future. We do need to look for new solutions and new technologies and new things that can solve these problems. The only question is when we approach these new technologies and trying to understand, incorporate, and implement them, we simply have to ask who's benefiting and who's losing. And I think if we can do that, then we can be on the right path. Yeah.
I guess we are way ahead of our prescribed time. So I'd like to thank both of you. Thanks, Maria, and thanks, Divya, for spending around 1.5 hours with us. And what a great day. I mean, it's well spent the last 1.5 hours talking about things that matter. And hopefully we'll continue to interact with the both of you and continue our fight for gender justice. Thanks a lot, and thanks to each and every one of you who are present here listening to us. And thank you for the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Bye.
Radhika. Thank
Thank
you.
you very much. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.